Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Starting Points Education podcast that we do every other week to talk about topics ranging from anger management, domestic violence, eating disorders, and all kinds of topics that you can read about on our YouTube channel, or I should say listen, not read about. So thank you for joining us. My name is Loretta Depka. I have the privilege of being the Executive Director at the Starting Point Inc. of New Jersey. And we are an education and referral organization that houses 35 practitioners and 25 support groups. So feel free to visit our website at startingpoint.org. We are lucky enough tonight to have Pat Obst, one of our counselors who is an LCSW and specializes in grief. We're talking about the topic of doing grief well. I love that topic, by the way, Pat. It just says it all, doesn't it? But you added a tagline to that when we talked about it, and you said, when we learn to do grief well, we can journey through our grieving, find healing, and move toward recreating our lives after loss. There is so much in that, and I look forward to hearing all about it tonight. But let me introduce you first. You are a therapist who specializes in loss and grief. And sometimes I think people forget to acknowledge that word loss. They just talk about grief. So I want to make sure that I correct myself. It's always grief and loss. She has worked with the grief journey with many clients and have experienced many losses herself, which have led her to create the Afterwards journey to help clients grieve, heal, and recreate their lives after loss. So Pat, I have like 3 questions that I want you to help me with in the introduction. First of all, and I think I've asked you this 1,000 times before, and that is, why specialize in grief? That has to be extremely difficult. Pat, you're muted. I'm sorry.
I didn't touch any. I don't know how I got muted. I didn't touch anything, I promise. Here I am. Yeah, I was a generalist at first, my first few years as a therapist. And then when I lost my infant son, Ricky, I took a year off. And when I came back, decided that my trajectory at that point was to be a grief counselor. I had a passion for it at that point. And so I work with people who have all types of losses, but I also, specialize in working with parents who've lost children. So it really was born out of my own experience, and then became more of something as far as a passion that when I helped several people come through the process, the grieving, the healing, not that it goes in exact stages, but the grieving, the healing, and recreating their lives, it was so fulfilling to be a part of that process that then I was kind of hooked.
So I have a sneaky suspicion you just described what the Afterwards journey is, but is that the theory behind it?
So a journey is different. And if you see me looking down, just looking at some notes, a journey is different from an adventure, right? An adventure is fun, exhilarating, exciting. A journey has other types of aspects to it. There's action, there's motion, because we have to do the work in the journey. We have to begin to learn to think differently, to reframe things, to accept things in a different way. I'll give you a quick example. I had a client who she had lost a son, and she believed the only way she would heal is if she came to terms with it in accepting, meaning, and I said, what does acceptance mean? She says, that I'm okay with it. I said, you will never be okay with the loss of your son. So you have to reframe that word acceptance. You have to define it differently. And once she was able to do that, I had maybe 5 more sessions with her and she was good to go. So sometimes that so there has to be action, there has to be motion. There's twists and turns, there's unknowns, unanswered questions. a client whose daughter was murdered about 12 years ago. She still doesn't have the answers to who did it, but she was able to recreate her life after her loss, even though she doesn't have the answers. It's about discovery of self and sometimes rediscovery. We think we've lost ourselves completely. But when I ask people who they were before the loss, and I said, well, when I say, do you feel like that person? They say, no. I said, well, you're just buried under the rubble. Now we have to rock by rock, get you out from under the rubble. And they find that who they are is still intact. It might be a little bit different, but a lot of who they are is still intact. It's vulnerability, it's risk. We have to open ourselves to feel. A lot of people want to numb, but we have to open ourselves to feel it. It's a chance to understand ourselves better. It's a willingness to accept and change. It's excavating and exploring. I like those words. It can be hard and scary. It can be hopeless, but it can also be hopeful. It's a quest. It's a wandering sometimes to find meaning. It's a passage from the past to the present. And it's really an active process. And if you look in a thesaurus at the antonym of the word journey, it's inaction. So a journey is you are doing the work of grieving, leading to healing, and then beginning to recreate your life again.
It's amazing. And I remember when you talked about this a little bit, and you've done 2 other podcasts with us, The Myths About Grief and Ambiguous Loss. So the one thing I just want our listeners to know is they can go in at any time on our YouTube education channel and listen to that as well. And also that you're going to be doing at least 2 more with us in this series about grief. So we'll talk about that a little more. So I know you sort of answered this question, and I'm sure it ties into your philosophy, but again, I can't imagine how it is to work with individuals in such pain. I heard you say that watching them heal is watching their healing process is helpful, but Pat, it's so sad.
Well, so you have to, here's the thing, is we can't get off this planet without experiencing loss. So we better learn how to do it well, or it's going to be a cumulative effect and we can become a train wreck, right?
Absolutely.
Here are some of the ways that we learn to do it well. We have to acknowledge it. A lot of times people will stay in denial of the pain of the reality, not necessarily that they deny the person died, but they deny that there's a process. It's important that in order to do grief well, you've got to get support. I'm very big on, in the very beginning, creating a support system for people before we even begin the work. Because a big ingredient to resilience is support. Not numbing your grief. Because when you numb your grief, you also numb any joy that could come back into your life. Sitting with it. People are afraid to sit with it because they're afraid they'll never come out of it. Well, you do. You stop crying eventually. And you're able to cry for an hour, get up, go do the laundry. I mean, we do that. Our brains are made to heal. So we will be able to sit with it and then take a breath, sit with it and take a breath. Reflecting on it. There's a woman by the name of Dr. Joan Rosenberg who has developed what's called the Grief Reset Protocol. She's on YouTube, Dr. Joan Rosenberg, and the Berg is B-E-R-G. If you just look up her name on YouTube with the word grief, it's an interesting, bringing you through to like a level of forgiveness of self or others. that can be helpful. So you have to be able to reflect on your grief. Creating a support system, I already talked about that. Asking for help, that's different from a support system. It's actually in the moment. Do you need to reach out? Do you need to call someone? Do you need to ask for that help? Accepting grief as a real thing. People don't want to think that it's something that even needs a name. Oh, somebody died, what can I do about it? Can't do anything about it anyway, so I might as well just go on. Being patient. I'd spend so much time asking people to be patient with their process because they want to hurry up and get out of the pain, but the pain is necessary. I can talk more about that. Accepting that time alone does not heal all wounds. We need to do the work, and that's that action, the journey part that I talked about. Listening to our grief. It's really important that we listen to what it's telling us. I had a client the other day who had a recent loss, and one was a death, and the other one was a divorce. And they both have decided to change their course load from 2 classes to 1 because they listened to what their grief was telling them, that they couldn't wrap their head around bringing in that much new information. So it's important that we listen to our grief. And then setting boundaries, asking for what we need and allowing ourselves to heal. When we have a broken leg, we have a cast. That's a boundary so that it can heal. Same kind of thing. Sometimes we need some isolation. We need to have that time away from the hustle and bustle of life for us to be able to heal. We need boundaries. So those are just some of the things that help us. If we put all that together, it can help us to grieve well.
You just talked about listening to grief. And something struck me there when you used that example. You're talking not only listening, but adjusting to what's better for you, right? At that moment.
Right. You can't, we're so used to, I have a lot of people who they consider themselves, caretakers, givers, fixers, right? And it's hard for them to take the time for themselves. And look at how many codependency groups do we have?
Really?
Switch. But if I tell people, take care of yourselves, which can be helpful. I use a woman by the name of Kristen Neff, who is a master with self-compassion. And so I use that as a tool. But when you tell people who are codependent to take care of themselves, they resist that. But when I say, listen to what your grief is telling you, and when I point it out in session, it feels different to them, and they're able to do it.
It's just those words really struck me, and that's really a wonderful way to say it.
Just one other thing I want to say about the word well, doing grief well means that we can come out on the other side with sometimes what we call PTG, post-traumatic growth, where we can actually come out on the other side of it, having grown, having evolved. And I'll talk a little bit more about the gifts in the ugly package a little bit further along that explains that.
So then there's another piece that you talk about, is that there are hidden losses that we don't necessarily recognize. You want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, so much we associate loss with death of a loved one, right? And maybe divorce, but that's about it. But there are, some of the ones that are more hidden are like, physical when people have injuries or illnesses, they lose abilities to do things that they normally would do. If somebody is a runner and running helps them cope with life, right? They get a major knee injury, the doctor says you can't run anymore. They go through a grieving process because they've just lost a major coping mechanism. So that's a type of hidden loss. Also, dreams. People have dreams of certain goals and things in their lives. I had someone who had a dream to be a professional women's basketball player, went over to Europe and played and all that, and then it got scrapped, and she lost that dream. She went through a grieving period. Another one that people really don't realize is childhood innocence, the loss of childhood innocence, because I unfortunately deal with a lot of people who've had childhood sexual abuse. And that loss of safety and security and sense of self, the loss of a natural maturity because they were so busy trying to protect themselves. So there are lots, and there are more than that, but those are just some examples of some hidden losses that I explore with people. Even some people will come into me with, like I have a woman who's going through a nasty divorce. So what I learned is what you see on the front is not, it goes a lot deeper than that. So she comes in with a divorce. I know it's not just going to be about a divorce, right?
Sure.
Well, there's all kinds of childhood sexual abuse she's dealt with. So we're dealing with a lot of different losses, not just the divorce.
And I guess if we're not listening, they can pile up on us, correct?
Or if we're trying to avoid and, that kind of thing.
That's a whole nother podcast, isn't it? So grief doesn't happen in a straight line is what I'm hearing you say. And we don't think of it that way. I mean, I think we think we're sad, we're going to get over this, and you're going to tell us the steps to do, and it's done. We come out better on the other end.
Right. Well, and part of the reason, I'm doing some studies right now with Columbia University of Complicated Grief, their program, and it's very formulaic. It's a 16-week thing, and there's some great stuff in it. But I know that people grieve in their context. And so as this very sort of pure program is being presented, I'm thinking, okay, so this person that they're using as the example lost a child. Okay. But it seems that everything else in her life is kind of intact. Husband, daughter. That's not what I get. I get clients who their context is, like I said, that they're coming from a place of childhood sexual abuse. There's context of abuse that's going on right now while they're experiencing a loss. I mean, there's all kinds of, people don't grieve in a vacuum. It's not a straight line. There are all kinds of detours they're taking while they're grieving. There's the cumulative effect of all their losses. So, right, it's not a this stage and then that stage kind of thing. David Kessler is a great grief specialist. He worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he said they spent most of their professional life debunking what people twisted her 5 stages of grief into. It was meant for cancer patients who were terminal and them working through their process, not meant for anything else but that, really. And got used in ways that it wasn't meant for. But he has it's just called grief.com, and he has a wonderful book called Finding Meaning that I recommend to a lot of my clients. But the other question that I get a lot besides, is it a straight line, is will it ever end? And no, you don't get over it. You learn to live with your losses as part of your story. And different layers come up at different times. My mom died when I was 24. When I turned 49, I was a mess. Why? Because I was going to be without her longer than I was with her. I had to figure out, I had to listen to that and say, what does that mean? That means I want to be with her. So how can I bring her into my presence more? I sat in a rocking chair more. I put more pictures up, that sort of thing. And then I felt better. So I listened to what my grief was telling me. But it took years before I hit that layer of my grief. So that's another reason why we have to do grief well, because it never ends. It breathes, it comes, it goes. We get triggered by different things. So if we have the tools, because I had the tools, I was able to roll through that and come out on the other side pretty quickly. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I guess, you know where I'm going with this, Pat, is, and we've talked about this in separate conversations about mindfulness, and taking that time to connect with ourselves. You're just making me think about how many of us still skim over that grief stuff in our mindfulness or our losses, because we're trying to focus on today, but the past sneaks in.
Right, exactly. So again, that's why we have to learn how to do it well. Otherwise, it can really trip us up.
So what happens to those of us that get stuck in grief?
So here, everything and anything can keep us stuck. Too much isolation. There's a certain amount of isolation that is normal and helpful in grief. A lot of times people say, oh, my girlfriends keep wanting me to go out, but, I'm so sad after losing my husband. I don't really want to go out. But they say, oh, it'll be good for me. It has to breathe. Okay, you might go out, but you might only stay out for an hour rather than 4 hours. Then you come home and you need to rest because your mind is it's a brain injury. It's the other podcast, right? It's a brain injury. So our mind can only take so much. We can only keep the mask on for so long. So we need to retreat and we need to isolate for a little bit because that's part of what we need to rest for the healing to happen, right? Just like with your body.
Sure.
You're not going to go out dancing for 4 hours, right? You need to rest. But too much isolation, then you get the depression setting in and the hopelessness. But that can get people stuck. Too much denial. People who you can't do anything about it anyway, and they just work. Men are famous for that, right? Or people are always out. And people do the opposite, where they never isolate because they never want to be with their feelings. So they're out with their friends all the time. Or always distracting themselves. An extreme in either direction, right? Either too much isolation or too much denial and pushing it aside can keep us stuck. Not able to talk about our loved ones. I had a woman who came in and told me 3 years after the loss of her daughter, and she was all jammed up. She said she had a pit here. And all we did the first, 3 months was talk about her daughter, because everybody had, after a year, you're supposed to be over it, right? So she wasn't talking about it anymore. The pit was gone after she was able to talk about her daughter. So when people can't talk about their loved one or the experience, that can keep them stuck. Multiple losses, when people have one after the other, and believe me, I have people with, sometimes I get twofers, I call them, poor parents who've lost 2 children to drug overdoses.
Oh.
And I've had people who, they lose a child and then they lose their spouse. These multiple losses, and not just the loss of people. I have someone who lost, he lost his job, lost his house, then lost his wife because they got divorced. Right? Boom, 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 boom. You can't even. Wow. So that can keep people stuck because they don't even know what to focus on to grieve. And jumping into another relationship can keep people stuck because they don't deal with it, right? And you get divorced.
Exactly.
Substance use, there's that numbing. And when we numb, we can't process. And then guilt. Guilt is a challenge. It can really slow down our healing process and keep us stuck. So those are just some examples of what keeps us stuck in our grief.
And that straight line that isn't a straight line, how does grief change over time?
Again, we get used to it. We don't get over it. Our brain wiring changes. Again, I'll just refer to that, the podcast on the grieving brain. In time, the wiring that was connected to that loved one, whether it be, the wife that now you're divorcing, or, a death, we create new wiring. Our brain is malleable. And so when we allow ourselves to have other experiences, this is why too much isolation is not good, because you need to have one foot in life, even though the other foot wants to be in bed with the covers over your head, so that you can create the new wiring of new experiences, new joys of grandchildren, or, that sort of thing. So the wiring changes. We need time for that swelling to go down. Again, it's just like a physical injury. The swelling has to go down. All the muscles and the nerve endings and all that have to come back together. I had breast cancer, bilateral mastectomies about 8 years ago. And it took about a year till I didn't feel certain sensations, and the doctor said, all that stuff has to come back together, so that it works together and it settles down. Same thing in our brain, that it changes over time. That this is a place where time does help, right?
Absolutely.
That starts to simmer down. There is a raw grief period. It's not an exact stage, but it's very raw. It's like an open wound. That's where all the triggering happens, right? I walked out the door after losing Ricky, my next door neighbor, who had a baby a couple months before. There she is out in the yard playing with her baby. I felt like she threw a dagger right through my heart. So we get triggered early on because we're so raw. But then if you're doing the grief work and it has that motion and you start to engage in life, then you can, the healing can begin to happen, and then we can be open to that joy and recreating our lives after loss. So it changes in large part because we do whatever that first question was, which was, we acknowledge and get support, and, we do the work of the journey.
Pat, during COVID, when isolation was at its highest and coming out of, and we're not out yet, I understand that. I'm not sure we ever will be, but are you seeing much more around loss?
It's actually simmered down a little bit as far as anxiety for people, and because people are out in the world, right? They're not feeling that isolation. They're not feeling the loss of their family members because they can hug them now, and that sort of thing. But I think it has, what remains is that we still have that loss of a sense of safety and knowing that, like, we can kind of rely on certain things about life.
Right.
Now we're like, okay, anything can happen at any time.
The absolute truth.
We've lost that security. That was false security, really, because life is never that way. It changes all the time. But this was it was so big and pervasive that it just whacked us in the head with that reality. The chaos exists. Another reason we need to learn to do grief well, because anything can happen. I don't know if anybody saw on the news that poor UPS driver who the plane.
Correct. Right.
What my partner's father used to say, what couldn't happen in a million years can happen in a second. And that's what happened to that UPS driver, right? I mean, these things don't make any sense. They're random, they're chaotic. So we have to learn how to roll through these things, how to grieve it, and then allow the healing to happen, and then recreate life around our new reality.
Okay, Pat, so we always sort of land in this place that always scares me a little bit, but I'm going to ask you, what are the gifts in the ugly package?
It's really about choices. So I help my clients to understand that we have several different paths we can take. One is we can deal with just the current loss. Another is we can deal with that loss and unfinished business of previous losses. We can also deal with our current loss, unfinished business of our previous losses, and whatever other wounds we have. It's sort of like we can treat it like exploratory surgery. You know, if the doctor says, oh, you know, I'm going to go in and fix that hernia, but while I'm in there anyway,
right.
Oh, you know, I'm going to tighten up your bladder a little bit, and I'm going to, you know.
The list goes on and on.
Other things that are in there. So I had a client who came to me over, her parents had died, but the major loss was her sister. There was a rift between she and her sister, that now they were, the conflict caused them to split and not have anything to do with each other. And that was the major loss she was dealing with. But what we ended up dealing with in the end was all kinds of things from her childhood that she was willing to, we do this whole letter writing process, willing to process through and come to resolution around a lot of her childhood wounds that were affecting her relationship with her husband. So it actually helped her have a better relationship with her husband. And while we were in there, we also tweaked some things about her relationship, you know, directly with her husband. So that's what I mean about there are gifts here. We can have resolution and healing and reconciliation around other wounds. We can also, you know, her sense of self-esteem is like she loves herself now. She didn't before. And it wasn't the work we did around the grief, it was the work we did around her childhood stuff. But because she was cracked open and broken over her grief, we said, all right, let's do it all. Right? You have to be brave, you have to be courageous to do that work. But I give people a choice. Just this loss, and other losses, or we can, since you're cracked wide open, we can take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. So those are the gifts in the ugly package, as well as, you know, I've had people find meaning in their lives when they were just these wandering souls, right?
Absolutely.
The loss they've gone through. I had a woman who she just said to me today, she said, you know, I've really gotten better at setting boundaries. I wasn't before my son died. But she said, by necessity, I've had to set boundaries. And now I'm really good at it, and I feel confident in it, and I feel that it's okay. So there's the ugly package is the loss and the pain, right? But there are gifts that can come out of that. And what better way to honor our loved one than for us to grow, right?
Pat, we hadn't talked about this, but we've talked about it in other podcasts, but I always want to sort of hit it when we're talking about loss and grief. And that is, how do you help somebody you love with loss and grief?
Don't hurry them. Don't tell them what they need. Let them tell you. Be a part of their support system. Validate what they're going through. Don't stop showing up. Like, I've had people who, they call someone who's grieving and they never call back. That's very typical. Keep calling anyway. Or, send a text. I'm thinking of you. Eventually, they'll reach back out. So, showing up by their side. No, forget the cliches. Let it kind of follow the person's lead. If the person is, I have people who get mad at God, right? Don't come down on them and say, oh, that's terrible. It wasn't God's fault. And let them be mad at God. That's where they're at right now. So we have to be careful not to put our beliefs or values or onto another person, right? Just meet them where they are and be by their side. Follow their lead.
Well, that was really helpful, because I know that is a question we get all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So Pat, tell me a little bit about where you're taking your practice now. I feel like you're at a turning point.
Yes, as opposed to a starting point.
Thank you for bringing that up.
I'll applaud for starting point. So, like I said, I was a generalist. A generalist means, anxiety and depression and relationship issues and that sort of thing. And then, although I became a grief specialist, I kept that part where, I was still working with people on that and doing some life coaching and that sort of thing. And PTSD and codependency and those sorts of things. Now, although PTSD and codependency, all those things can be part of grief and loss, I'm only working with people who, like, their main focus is their loss or losses. And then all those other parts, of course, we deal with in the process. And it's really around just a couple categories. Death of a loved one. And again, I specialize within that with parents who've lost children, divorce and breakup, life-changing illness or injury, where it's all of a sudden you're on disability, or, you have a prosthesis, or whatever it may be. And then just sort of there is a general, sort of almost, I call it other losses, but it's job, house. If you have a loss due to more like an estrangement, rather than a death, a living loss. We kind of talked about that in the ambiguous loss podcast, like an Alzheimer's person, right? You're doing that living loss thing. They're alive, like they're here, they're present, but they're gone, really.
Right.
That. So I'm really just those categories of loss. But because I have the experience with the PTSD and the codependency and the, like I said, people are in their context, right? So somebody can have a death, but I mean, I have parents who, they found their kid hanging. So they're dealing with PTSD. So I'm not going to necessarily take on a client who has PTSD. Let's say they were in a fire. I might send them to someone else who does EMDR or something like that,
Right.
type therapy, where if somebody comes to me, someone has died and they found them, so they have the trauma and the loss. And the fact that I've had that those years of experience dealing with all that periphery stuff, I can deal with it within the context of the loss.
I think this is really exciting, Pat, because the one thing that I do, and I think I said it in the beginning, is that we just grit our teeth through some losses unless death is associated. We don't acknowledge that it doesn't have to be a death
Right.
to grieve. So I really think I think it's very exciting about. And Pat, are there others that, across the country? Because don't forget, we're on a podcast where other people are listening that specialize that way in focusing on specifically losses and grief.
Yes, there are therapists who, that is their passion, and like David Kessler.
Okay.
That's what he does. He does loss and grief. And I call it loss and grief because you experience the loss first and then you grieve, as opposed to grief and loss.
I can't do that. For some reason, I have to say grief and loss.
It's
I'm accepting loss too.
That's usually how it's worded. Yes. And even if, like, psychology today, right, that a lot of people look on there to find a therapist. If you customize it and you put in, grief specialization, although a lot of people just do that as part of.
Right.
I mean, we've all been trained in it. But people who specialize, like I said, that the complex and complicated grief is different. And like people who've trained through that Columbia University complicated grief program.
Pat, do me a favor, just define complicated grief, because to me, grief is complicated, but
this will be another podcast, because
okay, we got to do that then.
So a not complicated loss, and let's just say loss of a loved one, for sake of argument, is like my grandmother, 95, died in her sleep. Lived a good life. We miss her, but like there's not. It's the natural course of things, right? The older people die first. That's sort of how we think it should be. And she lived a good life. So you see,
Right.
That's okay. That time-wise, there's not an exact time for grief, but generally the brain kind of adjusts and adapts to that within 6 months, year. Okay? You're not picking up the phone to call Nana, your brain adapts. Complicated grief comes in one of two ways, either by the very nature of the loss, like a violent death, like my client whose daughter was stabbed to death, a sudden death. You're not expecting it. It's just such a shock to the brain. It almost like gives you a concussion. I mean, it's that kind of shock. When it's multiple losses, the loss of a young person, because that's not the natural order of things, right? But then other losses that are not in kind of those categories, the grief can be complicated if we get stuck in all those ways that I talked about. If it's let's say it's something like my grandmother, right? But then there's a big family feud over the estate. Well, now it's complicated grief. You see?
Got it.
So sometimes it can turn into that based on whether or not the person's getting stuck, or based on extenuating circumstances that come in, and that just make it more complicated.
So Pat, you're going to have a new website, I understand.
Right, and it was supposed to be launched tonight, but we actually ran into kind of a security glitch. So we're working that out, and it will be, well, again, because I'm shifting. My other website was called Empowerful You, which was about being empowered in your mental health, but and included grief. But this one, the afterwards journey. The word afterwards means in the aftermath. So it's the aftermath of your loss, This is the journey you're going to go on in the aftermath. And journey, as I said in the beginning, it's an active process. Okay, when you go on a journey, you don't sit still, do you?
No.
Right? So it's, you have the aftermath of a loss, the journey that comes after that. That's what that means. And it's the journey through the grieving, the healing, into recreating your life after loss. Now, those things don't happen in a straight line any more than Kubler-Ross's stuff does. But you're more intensely grieving in the beginning, like all the time. You can have intense grief later. Look what I had at 49, right? That was intense grief I was feeling. But it was sort of a blip, it was there, and then I went over that bridge and got through it. Where early on, I mean, you are crying all the time. If you're not crying on the outside, you're crying on the inside. It's really impacting you. Your brain is all foggy, all that. So it's not a straight line, but you can also be healing while you're grieving. You can also be recreating your life. I went right into being involved with March of Dimes after Ricky died. That was part of my recreating my life. That was like 2 weeks after he died.
That was fast.
While I was healing.
Right.
But as far as the cumulative, like if you were to put it in percentages, earlier on, you're 90% grieving and only 10% healing and 9% and maybe 1% recreating your life. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
As you get further on and you do the work, then it flips. Then you're 90% recreating your life, and 10%, you're going to dip into that pain. See? Does that make sense?
Well, Pat, I have to thank you. This was very interesting, and as usual, I love talking to you. We will be doing a grieving during the holidays in November, so that I hope all of you will join us. It will be on the Starting Point website education page, and we'll get that up very quickly, hopefully within the next week, so you have the date right there for you. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to you all joining us again in 2 weeks. So thank you and good night.